Okay, wow, you really weren't kidding about wanting to go deep on leadership for this deep dive. We've got this whole stack of articles here. It looks like a pretty fascinating mix. Articles on leadership, yeah, obviously, but then organizational behavior, team dynamics, even some stuff about gender in negotiations.
There's even a paper in there about how people react to unfair treatment when they're just observing it, like not
Hmm.
even directly involved.
Oh, yeah, I remember seeing that one on the list. Third-party reactions. Something, something. It's pretty diverse collection of research, that's for sure. I'm guessing you sent over all of these because they kind of get at the question of what really makes leadership work.
You hit the nail on the head, not just effective leadership, but the kind of leadership that feels meaningful. Meaningful for the people being led, but also for the leaders themselves, right?
Right, exactly. I
Right.
mean, everyone's always talking about being a good leader, but what does that even mean? Like, does it always have to be about the bottom line, profits,
Yeah.
hitting those performance targets?
Well, and that's exactly where things start to get really interesting. One of the articles you sent over actually argues that for a while there, the whole field of leadership studies got a little too fixated on exactly that economic performance as like the ultimate measure of success.
Mm. So it's like we forgot about the human side of the equation.
Yeah, kind of. Revisiting the meaning of leadership, that's the title of the article. And the authors make a pretty compelling case that this shift away from meaning making and towards just pure economic outcomes, it's actually kind of a problem.
A problem how?
Well, they go back and look at some of the classic thinkers on this topic, Weber, Durkheim, these guys who were like wrestling with how to find meaning in a world that was becoming increasingly dominated by capitalism.
Oh, yeah, I vaguely remember those names from my sociology class back in college.
Yeah.
They have kind of a bleak outlook on the whole thing. Like, work was just this soul-crushing necessity in the modern world.
Yeah, they weren't exactly known for their optimism, that's for sure. But this is where the idea of leadership comes in, right? Because the article contrasts those sort of gloomy views of modern work with the example of, get this, John Calvin,
The theologian.
the one and only. And basically, Calvin was able to inspire his followers to see their work not just as a means to an end, but as a religious calling, a way to serve God. And, that completely transformed how people experienced work, how they found meaning in it.
Wow, yeah, talk about a reframing. Okay, so we're agreed that meaning is important, right? That it's like this key ingredient for both leaders and followers. But I mean, how do you actually study that? It's not exactly quantifiable, is it? You can't just like measure meaning with a ruler.
You'd think so, right? But here's where things get really wild. The researchers in this article about leadership and meaning, they actually analyzed the grammar that people use when they talk about their work.
Wait, grammar,
Oh,
as in like parts of speech and sentence structure? I thought we were talking about leadership, not like diagramming sentences.
I know, right? It sounds totally bizarre, but stay with me here. Because they found that the way people use language is actually a really powerful indicator of their mental state, even more so than the actual content of what they're saying, if you can believe it.
Oh, okay. And I mean, presumably your mental state is going to be pretty closely tied to how much meaning you find in your life, your work, all that.
Exactly. And so they have these two examples in the article, a steelworker and a jockey. And based purely on their language, the researchers were able to conclude that the jockey actually found his work more meaningful.
Seriously. The jockey, I would totally guess the steel worker.
Yeah.
Building things, contributing to society, the whole blue-collar hero thing.
Yeah, it's definitely counterintuitive, but when you actually look at the grammar, the jockey's language is much more active and engaged, much more connected to his personal experience. So, for instance, the jockey talks about how, I urged my horse toward the finish line. But the steelworker, he's much more likely to describe his work in a detached way, like the beam was lifted into place. Ah, yeah, I see what you mean. It's like the jockey is really in the action, whereas the steelworker sounds more, I don't know, removed from the process somehow.
Exactly. And the researchers actually have a term for this grammatical metaphor. They argue that the steelworker's language, the way he distances himself from the action, it's a sign of depersonalization. Like his work has become just this series of tasks rather than something he's really invested in, something that feels meaningful to him.
So it's not just what you do, it's how you think and talk about what you do.
Right. The takeaway here being that the way we use language can reveal a lot about our sense of purpose, control, all those things that contribute to finding meaning in our work. We should all probably pay more attention to our own grammatical metaphors.
Agreed. Okay, now I'm really curious to dig into some of these other articles, especially the ones about teams. because leading a team, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this whole leadership thing, right? Absolutely. And actually, one of the articles you sent, When and How Team Leaders Matter, it argues that we often oversimplify things when we talk about leading teams. Like, it's not always about the leader's actions, their specific behaviors or whatever. Sometimes there are all these external factors that come into play and end up really constraining what a leader can actually achieve.
So are you saying that sometimes a leader's hands are tied no matter how, like, skilled or charismatic they might be?
Exactly. The article uses the example of airline pilots. They have all these procedures to follow, and most of the time things run pretty smoothly. But in an emergency situation, when every second counts, that's when the captain's leadership really matters.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you wonder if we're too quick to give leaders credit for successes and blame them for failures. Like, what if it's more about the context than the individual?
It's a critical question to be asking. And this leads us to another really interesting point that the article brings up. Are we even using teams effectively in the first place? Because the research suggests that a lot of times managers form teams without really stopping to think about whether it's the best approach.
Uh, yeah. I think we've all been on those teams where it's like, why are we even doing this as a group?
Right, like we could have just as easily accomplished this individually. And the article actually points out that there are all these different types of teams, real work teams, where everyone's interdependent, co-acting groups, where people work more independently but towards a shared outcome, and then even virtual teams. So the key is choosing the right structure for the task at hand. Like, are you trying to solve a complex problem? Coordinate a bunch of individual efforts, or actually produce something collectively?
So before we even get to leadership styles, coaching techniques, all of that, we need to make sure we're setting the stage for success by choosing the right type of team in the first place.
Exactly. It's like building a house, right? You need to make sure you have the right foundation before you start worrying about the paint color or the landscaping.
Okay, I like that analogy. So what does the foundation for a successful team look like? What are the key elements?
Well, according to the article, there are three: a compelling direction, a clear structure, and a supportive context.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's break those down a bit, shall we? What exactly do they mean by a compelling direction? Is that just a fancy way of saying set a goal?
Well, kind of, but it's more than just any old goal, right? A compelling direction, it's got to be something that really motivates people, something that gets them excited and makes them feel like their work matters.
So not just another item on a to-do list, but something that connects to a bigger purpose.
Exactly.
And what about this enabling structure? What does that look like in practice?
It's all about clarity, basically. Having clear roles and responsibilities, clear processes and procedures. It's like the framework that allows the team to function effectively. Right. Without people constantly tripping over each other or getting bogged down in confusion.
It makes sense. Without that structure, it's like you're just stumbling around in the dark, never quite sure what you're supposed to be doing or who you're supposed to be talking to.
Right.
Okay, and then the last element, a supportive context. What does that entail?
This is where leadership really comes into play. It's about creating an environment where the team can thrive, where they have the resources they need, where their efforts are recognized and appreciated, and where there are systems in place to help them overcome obstacles. Do you remember that story in the article about Hank, the production manager?
Oh yeah, Hank.
Yeah.
The guy who is constantly butting heads with other departments.
Exactly. And so what did he do? He invited the heads of all these departments to go hunting with him.
Oh yeah. So he was using his political skills to actually change the system that was hindering his team.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how a leader can use their influence not just to manage their team directly, but to actually advocate for them within the larger organization.
It's like he was playing 4D chess while everyone else was stuck on checkers.
Pretty much. Okay, but besides setting the stage for success, there's another crucial ingredient for effective teams, and this applies to leadership in general: trust.
You can't have a high-performing team without trust. That's kind of leadership 101, right?
It is. But the interesting thing is, the way that trust actually plays out in practice, it's often a lot more complex than we think. There's this other article you sent, Normal Acts of Irrational Trust, and it highlights some research that's pretty surprising. Like, it turns out that sometimes taking a big leap of faith is actually more effective than being cautious and testing the waters.
Wait, really? I've always thought it was better to, be cautious when it comes to trust. Don't want to get burned.
I know, it seems counterintuitive, but the research they cite, they've done all these studies with something called trust games, and what they found is that The people who are willing to make large early investments in trust, they often end up reaping the rewards. It's almost like going all in can actually encourage the other person to reciprocate in kind.
So sometimes blind faith is the best strategy. Tell me more about this because I am very skeptical.
It's wild, right? So, to explain this phenomenon, they talk about something called the motivated attributions model. Basically, it suggests that when we're really dependent on someone, we're actually motivated to see them as trustworthy.
It's like we're tricking ourselves into trusting them because we need them to come through for us.
Exactly. And that self-persuasion, that belief that the other person is trustworthy, it actually can lead to more cooperative behavior from both sides, which ends up strengthening the relationship in the long run. So yeah, sometimes a little calculated risk-taking can really pay off, even when it comes to something as sensitive as trust.
Hmm. I'm going to need to think about this one a bit more. Okay, so we've talked about how trust is essential for both teams and leadership in general. But I'm curious to get your take on how this all plays out when we factor in gender. Like, do men and women approach trust differently? Or risk? Do they even lead differently in general?
Ah, yes, the age-old question. Do men and women lead differently? And unfortunately, the research on this is, well, it's complicated. The article you sent, Gender and Negotiation, it kind of acknowledges right off the bat that there are so many factors at play that it's pretty much impossible to make any blanket statements about how, men lead like this and women lead like that.
So no easy answers there then.
Not really, but there are some really interesting findings that challenge our assumptions. Like, for instance, some research actually suggests that when women are in positions of power, they can actually be more exploitative than men in certain situations.
Oh, that's not what I was expecting.
Yeah, it goes against a lot of the stereotypes we have about women being more collaborative or nurturing leaders.
Right, exactly. It really makes you wonder how much our own biases and preconceptions are influencing how we perceive different leadership styles. Like, are we seeing what we expect to see rather than what's actually happening?
It's a great question to be asking ourselves, and it's a good reminder that we all have blind spots, especially when it comes to something as complex as leadership.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the dynamics between leaders and followers, but I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on how leadership affects those outside of those direct relationships. Like, what about the general public? Do our perceptions of a leader influence how we view the organization as a whole?
That's a great question. And actually, that's where that article about third-party reactions comes into play. Because what the research shows is that leadership, it extends beyond the immediate circle. It actually influences how others perceive the organization as a whole, whether it's customers, investors, or just the general public.
So, like, the actions of a leader can have ripple effects, even on people who aren't directly involved.
Absolutely. The article gives the example of the NBA lockout. So you had the players' union on one side and the team owners on the other, right? But even people who weren't directly involved in those negotiations, they formed opinions about the leaders on both sides just based on how they were handling the situation.
That makes a lot of sense. It
Like
shows
you.
how much weight comes with leadership. It's not just about managing a team. It's about representing something much larger.
It is.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, there's this idea that gets thrown around a lot about how organizations are becoming more and more alike, right? Like everyone's copying each other's strategies and structures, chasing after the same benchmarks of success.
Ah, yes. The idea of isomorphism. Makes sense on the surface, right?
Yeah,
If everyone's chasing the same best practices, you'd expect them to eventually become more homogenous.
right. Like everyone converging on this one right way to do things.
But here's where things get interesting. Because the article you sent about isomorphism in reverse, it actually challenges that whole assumption. It looks at the steel industry, of all things, not exactly known for being like cutting edge or innovative, and what they find is that over time, it actually became more diverse, not less.
What? How is that even possible?
Well, the researchers suggest that a couple of key things happened. One was deregulation, which really shook up the industry landscape and forced companies to start adapting in new ways. And the other was, of course, rapid technological change. Like all of a sudden, there were all these new ways to produce steel, and that created new opportunities for companies to differentiate themselves.
So it's kind of a case of innovate or die.
Pretty much. And that pressure to adapt and innovate, it actually led to greater diversity in the industry as a whole. It's like, imagine you're shaking up a snow globe, right? Suddenly, all those little snowflakes are swirling around in all these new and unexpected patterns.
I love that image. It really gets at this idea that sometimes disruption can actually be a catalyst for greater diversity and innovation, which is, not what you typically expect.
Exactly. It's like The old ways of doing things, they get shaken up, and suddenly there's this space for new ideas and approaches to emerge, and that's what happened in the steel industry. And who knows, maybe this trend of isomorphism in reverse, maybe it's happening in other industries as well.
Maybe so. It definitely gives me hope that maybe there's not just one right way to lead or organize a company. Like maybe there's actually a lot more room for creativity and experimentation than we think.
I think so too. And that actually brings us back to that central theme of meaning making in leadership, right? Because if there's no one blueprint for success, if organizations are becoming more diverse in their approaches, then leadership becomes less about following a prescribed path and more about forging your own.
More about vision, creativity, courage, all those things that we typically associate with, true leadership.
Exactly. And it also challenges this idea that meaning is something that's simply handed down from the top. Like, if organizations are becoming more diverse, more complex, then meaning making actually becomes more of a collaborative process, a shared understanding that emerges from the interactions between leaders and followers.
So it's less about the leader, commanding and controlling, and more about them inspiring and empowering,
Mm.
creating the conditions for meaning to emerge.
Exactly. And recognizing that context is everything. Like, we've seen how external factors like deregulation or technological change can really shape the opportunities and constraints that leaders face. So a leader's actions might be highly consequential in one situation, but totally insignificant in another. It's not about being a great leader in the abstract, but about, leading greatly in the moments that matter.
Which can arise pretty unexpectedly, as we've seen. It means leaders need to be adaptable, ready to embrace the challenge when it presents itself.
It does. It's about being present, making tough decisions, and understanding that leadership isn't just about outcomes, it's about creating meaning for ourselves and those around us.
Wow, this is all giving me a lot to think about. I'm starting to see leadership in a whole new light.
Mm,
But I gotta admit, I'm still processing everything we've covered.
it's a lot to unpack.
It is. But hey, that's what we do here at the Deep Dive, right?
Yeah.
Unpack complex ideas, explore different perspectives, and hopefully walk away with some new insights that we can apply to our own lives.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first segment, but we still have a few more articles to discuss, including that fascinating one about CEOs and how their role has evolved over time.
Oh yeah, that one's definitely on my mind. And I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on, the big so what here. Like we've talked about all these different aspects of leadership, but what's the deeper purpose of it all? Why should we care about creating these meaningful leadership experiences?
Ah, yes. The why. The ultimate question. We'll definitely get to that in the next segment.
Okay, so where were we? Ah, he has a compelling direction, an enabling structure, and a supportive context. Sounds like, I don't know, kind of a recipe for success. But what do those actually look like in practice? Like, how do you actually create those things?
Right. So a compelling direction, it's really all about setting a goal that truly motivates people.
Yeah.
It's got to be challenging, yeah, but also clear, consequential, something that makes people feel like their work really matters.
So not just another item on a to-do list, but something that actually connects to a bigger purpose.
Exactly. And then there's the enabling structure, which is really all about clarity. Clear roles, clear responsibilities, clear processes. It's the framework that allows the team to actually function effectively without people, constantly tripping over each other or getting bogged down in confusion.
Right, like a well-oiled machine, basically.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, who they're supposed to be talking to.
Exactly. And then, of course, the last element, the supportive context. And this is where leadership, really comes into play because it's about creating an environment where the team can thrive. Do they have the resources they need? Are their efforts being recognized? Are there systems in place to help them overcome obstacles? Things like that. Do you remember that story in the article, the one about Hank, the production manager?
Yeah, Hank.
Yeah.
The guy who, like, his teams were constantly hitting these roadblocks because of issues with other departments. What did he do? Oh, yeah, he took all the department heads, like hunting.
He did. And it's a classic example of how a leader can actually use their influence, not just to manage their team directly, but to actually change the system that's hindering them. Like, he realized that building relationships, advocating for his team, that was just as important as, any of the technical skills or whatever.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
like he was thinking strategically, playing the long game, where everyone else was just focused on the immediate task at hand.
Exactly. Okay, but besides setting the stage for success, there's another crucial ingredient for effective teams, and I'd argue for leadership in general, and that's trust.
You can't have a high-performing team without trust, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that article you sent, the one about normal acts of irrational trust, it actually dives into some research on how trust works. And some of the findings are pretty surprising. Like, did you know that sometimes taking a big leap of faith can actually be more effective than being cautious and, testing the waters?
Seriously.
Yeah.
I always thought it was better to be, a little bit cautious when it comes to trust.
Yeah.
Like, better safe than sorry, right?
You'd think so, right. But the research they cite, all these studies on trust games, it actually shows that the people who are willing to make large early investments in trust, they often end up reaping the rewards. It's almost like going all in can actually encourage the other person to reciprocate in kind.
So sometimes blind faith is the best strategy. I'm
Right.
very skeptical, but please go on.
I know, it's kind of wild, right? So to explain this phenomenon, they talk about something called the motivated attributions model, which basically says that when we're really dependent on someone, we're actually motivated to see them as trustworthy. It's like we convince ourselves that they're going to come through for us because, we need them to.
It's like we're tricking ourselves into trusting them because we need them to.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that self-persuasion, that belief in the other person's trustworthiness, it actually can lead to more cooperative behavior from both sides, which, ends up strengthening the relationship in the long run. So, yeah, sometimes a little calculated risk-taking can actually pay off, even when it comes to something as sensitive as trust.
That is a very interesting perspective on trust. I'm going to have to mull that one over for a while.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how trust is essential for teams and really for leadership in general.
hmm
But I'm wondering how this all plays out when you factor in gender. Like, do men and women approach trust differently or risk? Or even, do they lead differently in general?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? Do men and women lead differently? And the research on this is, well, complicated, to say the least. The article you sent, the one about gender and negotiation, it pretty much acknowledges right up front that there are so many factors at play that it's almost impossible to make any sort of blanket statements about how, men lead versus how women lead.
So no easy answers then.
Nope. But there are some really interesting findings that, they kind of challenge our assumptions. Like, for instance, some research suggests that when women are in positions of power, they can actually be more exploitative than men in certain situations.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's not what I was expecting at all.
Right. It kind of goes against a lot of the stereotypes we have about, women being more collaborative or nurturing leaders.
For sure. Makes you wonder how much our own biases and preconceptions are shaping how we view different leadership styles. Like, are we seeing what we expect to see rather than what's actually happening?
It's a great question to be asking. And it's a good reminder that we all have blind spots, especially when it comes to something as complex as leadership.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about, the dynamics between leaders and followers, but I'm also curious to get your take on how leadership affects those outside of those direct relationships. Like, what about the general public? How do our perceptions of a leader influence how we view the organization as a whole?
That is such a good question. And actually, that's where that article about third-party reactions, the one we talked about earlier, really comes into play. Because the research shows that leadership, it actually extends beyond just, that immediate circle. It influences how others perceive the organization as a whole, whether it's customers, investors, or just, the general public.
So the actions of a leader can have ripple effects,
Yeah.
even on people who aren't directly involved.
Totally. They actually give this really great example in the article about the NBA lockout. Remember that?
Yeah.
Where you had the players' union on one side and the team owners on the other. But what was interesting was that even people who weren't directly involved in those negotiations, they still formed these strong opinions about the leaders on both sides, just based on how they were handling the situation, how they were presenting themselves in the media, all of that.
Yeah, makes sense. It just goes to show how much weight comes with leadership. It's not just about managing a team, it's about representing something much larger.
Absolutely. Okay, but shifting gears for a second, there's this idea that gets thrown around a lot about how, organizations are becoming more and more alike everyone copying each other's strategies, their structures,
Yeah.
chasing after the same benchmarks of success.
Right, like this whole best practices thing.
Right.
Which, on the surface, it makes sense, right? Like, if everyone's trying to do the same thing, the right thing, you'd expect them to eventually become more homogeneous, converge on this one way of doing things.
Yeah, you would. And that's the whole idea of isomorphism, right? But here's where things get interesting, because there was this article you sent about isomorphism in reverse. And it actually challenges that whole assumption. So they looked at the steel industry Of all things, not exactly known for being like cutting edge.
Right. Not exactly the first industry that comes to mind when you think of innovation.
Nope. But what they found was that over time, the steel industry actually became more diverse, not less.
Wait, seriously? How is that even possible?
It is. And the researchers, they suggest that a couple of things happened. One was deregulation, which really shook things up, forced companies to start adapting in new ways. And then, of course, there was this rapid technological change happening at the same time. Like, all of a sudden, there were all these new ways to produce steel, which created, all these new opportunities for companies to differentiate themselves.
So it was kind of a case of, like, innovate or die, basically.
Pretty much. And that pressure to adapt and innovate, it actually led to greater diversity in the industry as a whole. Like imagine you're shaking up a snow globe, right?
Yeah.
And all those little snowflakes, they're suddenly swirling around in all these new and unexpected patterns.
I love that analogy. It really gets at how, disruption can actually be a catalyst for greater diversity and innovation, which is, not typically how we think about it.
Exactly. Like all of a sudden, the old ways of doing things, they're no longer working.
Yeah.
So there's this space for new ideas and approaches to emerge. And that's what happened in this steel industry, at least according to this research. And who knows, maybe this trend of like isomorphism in reverse, maybe it's happening in other industries as well. We just haven't, studied it yet.
Maybe so. It gives me hope that, maybe there's not just one right way to lead or to organize a company. Like maybe there's actually a lot more room for creativity and experimentation than we think.
I think so too. And it kind of brings us back to that central theme of meaning making and leadership, right?
Yeah.
Because if there's no one blueprint for success, if organizations are becoming more diverse in their approaches, then leadership becomes less about following a prescribed path and more about forging your own.
Right. More about vision, creativity, courage,
Yeah.
all those things that we typically associate with, like true leadership.
Exactly. And it also challenges this idea that meaning is something that's just handed down from the top, right? Like if organizations are becoming more diverse, more complex, then meaning making actually becomes more of a collaborative process, a shared understanding that emerges from, the interactions between leaders and followers.
So it's less about the leader, commanding, controlling, and more about them, you know, inspiring, empowering, creating the conditions for meaning to emerge rather than dictating what that meaning should be.
Exactly. And recognizing that context is everything. Like we've seen how these external factors, like deregulation, technological change, all of that, how it can really shape the opportunities and constraints that leaders face. A leader's actions might be highly consequential in one situation, but totally insignificant in another. So it's not about being a great leader in the abstract, but about leading greatly in the moments that matter.
Which can arise very unexpectedly, as we've seen, which means leaders need to be, adaptable, ready to embrace the challenge when it presents itself.
They do. It's about being present, making those tough calls, and just, really understanding that leadership isn't just about outcomes. It's about creating meaning for ourselves and for those around us.
Wow. This conversation is really giving you a lot to think about. I'm honestly starting to see leadership in a whole new light after going through all these articles with you. But I got to admit, my brain's a little fried right now. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot. But hey, that's what we do here at the Deep Dive, right?
Yeah, we do. We unpack complex ideas, we explore all these different perspectives, and hopefully we walk away with some new insights that we can apply to our own lives, our own work.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this segment, but we still have a few more articles to discuss, including that really fascinating one about CEOs and how their role has evolved over time.
Oh, yeah, that was definitely been on my mind. And I'm also really curious to hear your thoughts on, the big so what here. Like we've talked about all these different aspects of leadership, but what's the deeper purpose of it all? Why should we care about creating these meaningful leadership experiences, both for ourselves and for others?
Ah, yes. The why, the ultimate question. And you know what? That's a perfect place to pick up in our next segment.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our leadership deep dive. And wow, it's been quite a journey. We've covered so much ground from like the shifting definition of leadership to that whole thing about, the steel industry actually becoming more diverse. My brain's still buzzing a little bit.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in, but I think it sets us up perfectly for this last part of our conversation.
Exactly. Because we've talked about the what, the how, but we haven't really tackled the big,
Why?
the why. Exactly. Like, why does all this even matter? What's the deeper purpose of leadership? Why should we even care about, trying to make it more meaningful?
Okay, so let's go back to that idea of meaning making. Remember that first article, Revisiting the Meaning of Leadership? How it argued that leadership isn't just about achieving goals, it's about helping people connect to something, something larger than themselves.
Right, right. Something that gives their work, maybe even their lives, a deeper sense of purpose.
Exactly. And that example of John Calvin, the one we talked about earlier, about how he reframed work as like a religious calling, I think that's such a powerful illustration of how leadership can actually infuse even, seemingly mundane tasks with a real sense of meaning.
It's like, it's not about the task itself, right? It's about the story we tell ourselves about why it matters.
100%. And I think this has implications not just for, individuals and teams, but for society as a whole.
Right, because if people are finding meaning in their work, presumably they're going to be more engaged, more productive, more, fulfilled.
For sure. And I mean, think about it. A society full of engaged, fulfilled individuals, that's got to be a healthier, more vibrant society, right?
So you're saying that, like, meaningful leadership can actually have this ripple effect. It's not just about the leader and the follower, but it can create a more positive, more productive environment for everyone.
That's the idea. It's about, fostering a sense of community, inspiring collaboration, all of that good stuff.
So it's not just about, climbing the corporate ladder, making a profit, any of that. It's about actually using your influence to, make a difference in the world.
Yeah, and that difference can take, so many different forms. It could be about creating products that improve people's lives,
Yeah.
or building a company culture that values diversity and inclusion, or even speaking out against injustice in your community. It's about aligning your actions with your values
Yeah.
and, hopefully inspiring others to do the same.
Walking the talk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And it brings us to another important piece of the why, Leadership isn't just about what you do, it's also about who you are.
Right, like embodying certain values,
Mhm.
integrity, empathy, courage, that kind of thing.
Yes. And, that way of being, that commitment to living your values, it can have such a profound impact on the people around you, like your team, your family, even your community.
It's a powerful reminder that, we all have the potential to be leaders, regardless of our, like, formal roles or titles.
I couldn't agree more. Leadership isn't reserved for the select few, right? It's something we can all cultivate within ourselves.
Okay, so if we do want to create a world where leadership is more meaningful, where it's about, purpose and values and making a difference, where do we even start?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think our deep dive today can offer like a simple step-by-step guide, but it does give us some, valuable insights.
Yeah, we talked about how important it is to understand context, to build trust, to embrace diversity, and also to be willing to, challenge some of those traditional leadership models.
For sure. And to be willing to, challenge the status quo, experiment, and learn from our mistakes along the way.
It sounds like embracing the complexity of leadership is, like, really key here. There's no single path to success, no magic formula, but if we stay focused on the why, on our purpose and our values, we can at least, navigate the journey more effectively.
You got it. And I think that's a great place to wrap things up. If we lose sight of the why, leadership can so easily become just this empty pursuit, right? A game of power and ego rather than, a force for good in the world.
So we got to keep asking ourselves those tough questions, right? Like, why am I doing this? What do I hope to achieve? What kind of impact do I want to have?
Exactly. Those are the questions that are going to keep us grounded, keep us on the right path, and hopefully, help us all become the kind of leaders the world needs.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for, sharing your insights, helping me connect all these dots. This deep dive has given me a lot to reflect on.
My pleasure. It's been great chatting with you. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into leadership. We hope you found it, insightful, maybe even a little bit inspiring. And remember, leadership isn't just about what you achieve, but who you become along the way. So keep learning, keep growing, and until next time, keep diving deep.